You step off the merchant's ramp at Ostia, sandals wet from the sea spray, and the first thing that hits you isn't the grandeur of the city or the marble colonnades you pictured. It's a sour, clinging smell. Brine mixed with fermented grain, human waste, and something darker that you can't name but recognize instantly as danger. You think you can handle this. You think a day won't matter. By nightfall, you wouldn't recognize yourself in a mirror. If you like deep dive history, subscribe for more quick era breakdowns. Rome, at its busiest, looks like an argument solved by money and muscle. Magistrates, merchants, soldiers, housewives, dockhands, priests, all crammed into streets meant for carts and chatter. The city is a knot of exchange, grain from Egypt, oil from Hispania, slaves and silks and gossip arriving by the hundreds of ships that hug the Tiber or spill into the port at Ostia. Apartments called insulae rise like stacked boxes. Narrow stairwells funnel families into single rooms. Public latrines are social theatres. Baths are a daily ritual. The forum the trading floor for reputation and influence. This is what we admire. Aqueducts delivering water miles from the hills, roads that stitch the empire together, law and engineering that make an enormous city possible. But those same marvels, the density, the flow of goods and people, the reliance on shared infrastructures, are the exact reasons a stranger from our time would be in life-threatening peril before the sunset. Interconnectedness is not only a triumph, it is a vulnerability. Imagine the city as a living network where every handshake, every basket of grain, every rodent harboring a parasite, every bucket that's passed from hand to hand becomes a possible path for a tiny, invisible invader. We don't need to name which particular germ will get you. The mechanics alone are enough to understand why modern habits would fail here. How does a disease travel in such a world? Think in three parts: the agent, the carrier, and the network. The agent is the pathogen, something microscopic that can make you sick. The carrier can be animate or inanimate. Rats that infest the hulls of merchant ships, fleas that live on those rats, lice that cling to cloaks, or contaminated grain and water. The network is the city itself. Crowded markets, communal latrines where strangers' hands touch the same surfaces, bathhouses where bodies mingle and breath is shared, insular staircases where tenements exchange sweat and coughs. Remove any one of these, and a chain breaks. In Rome, none of them are missing. Start with the ships. Grain is the lifeblood of urban Rome. Massive horea, warehouses for grain, back up against the docks. A flotilla arrives from a distant province, sacks of barley, wheat, perhaps even pulses damp from long hold times. Rats love grain. They swarm the hold, gnaw the sacks, nest under the ropes. A rat dies in a dark corner. Fleas move to a new host, and those fleas hop down the rope onto a sailor's ankle. The sailor hauls a sack into the cart, wipes his hands on his tunic, and squeezes past you on the quay. You buy a portion of bread from a vendor who leaned on the same sacks. Or picture the public latrine. It's not an intimate room with lock and key, it's a stone bench with holes carved along a channel. People sit shoulder to shoulder. Someone drops a piece of food, a child grabs it, fingers go to mouth. The water that should flush waste away is often stagnant or shared with other uses. The sight of excrement is normal here. It is not the alarm bell for a cautionary response. Instead, it's the background hum of daily life, until the hum becomes a screaming disruption because the thing living in that waste is now circulating through the city. Then there are the baths. You go for warmth and social connection. The tepidarium, the caldarium, the frigidarium. You move through them like a creature in a ritual of cleanliness that, paradoxically, increases exposure. Crowded pools are shallow coliseums of proximity. Breathing each other's steam, rubbing oils on each other's skin, sharing strigils and benches. Any respiratory or skin-borne infection finds a highway here. None of this requires us to accuse the Romans of ignorance or negligence. They had practices that made sense in their world. Medical theory was dominated by humors and balance, not microbes. Physicians recommended bloodletting, purges, dietary regimes. Priests and augurs read omens and gave ritual remedies. Some municipal officials tried ad hoc measures, burning bedding, removing corpses from houses, restricting access to certain public spaces, because anyone who has seen death spread quickly will try something. But without an understanding of microscopic transmission, and without the logistical means to isolate and test, these responses were often late and wrong-headed, sometimes making things worse by concentrating people or by allowing contaminated goods to keep moving. Now step into the day itself and watch how small, ordinary choices cascade into lethal outcomes. Morning. You leave your lodgings in an insula. The stair is steep, the steps smoothed by centuries of boots and sandals. Children and the elderly share the narrow landings. You count heads as you push through, a spinner carrying bundles of wool, a bread seller with flour dusting his hair, a woman carrying a jar of water from the fountain. You brush shoulders with a legionary on leave, then with a priest wrapped in a soiled toga, then a grain carrier with a cough he's had for days. Handshakes and gossip are the currency of trust. They're also vectors for whatever microbes any of those bodies host. You cross the forum. Temples ring with the clang of bronze and the low murmur of traders. Loud hawkers boast of the best olive oil. A money changer counts coins scraped with secret dust. Coins, too, are objects that move through millions of hands. Every punch of metal and grease-smudged denarius is a tiny traveling surface. A vendor with infected fingers touches a coin. That coin pays for a loaf. The buyer wipes his hands on his tunic. The buyer later touches his mouth. That touch can be as consequential as a flea bite if the disease travels via contamination. The market is where food changes hands quickly, often without utensils, and where hygiene is improvised. Fish is gutted on wooden stools, meat is left in the open. Vegetables are rinsed in buckets shared among vendors. Imagine buying a piece of fruit, licking your fingers, and then sitting down in the shade near an open drain, not because you like the view of the filth, but because shade is scarce and you are hungry. A rodent that foraged the grain sacks scuttles under the stool. A flea jumps. The small sequence, rodent to flea to stool to your hands, compresses the exposure window. It makes no difference whether the pathogen originated in a far province or in an animal that shared your street. Once it's in that chain, you're on the line. Midday. You join a public latrine. It's a social space, a place for debate as much as release. People smear oil, they pass small cups, they argue about the latest edict. The latrine water is shared, the channel all flow is intermittent, a child drops a piece of bread, and someone else picks it up. Excrement, food, and water circulate in close proximity. If a disease spreads through fecal contamination, and many gastrointestinal illnesses do, then the latrine is not just an unpleasant stop, it's a transmission hub. Even diseases that require close contact can exploit the nudges and brushings of this communal life. You grab a quick meal at a thermopolium, a tavern that serves hot food. The cook scoops from big pots with the same spoon he uses to stir and serve. He wipes his hand on a cloth, which has been used all morning to clear dust, sweat, and perhaps worse. He coughs into his sleeve and keeps ladling. Spices mask some smells, but they don't neutralize a pathogen. Foodborne illnesses hitch rides on improperly stored grain or on carriers who handle both food and refuse. Afternoon, you decide to go to the baths. The warm, humid air is a dream for the skin, but a paradise for microbial survival. You sit on the marble bench beside dozens of bodies. A man near you spits, clearing his throat, a habit that sends snot and droplets into the shared air. Lathered oils and open pores create new opportunities for skin infections. Steam rises, breath mingles. If a respiratory illness is present, influenza-like disease or something else, a single cough in the caldarium is a broadcast. You towel off with a communal linen, you scratch a scab. A thread of your tunic is caught by the next person who uses it. The contagion doesn't care about your intentions. Or imagine an afternoon at the amphitheater. The crowd presses together to watch spectacle. People jostle, shout, and touch. Performers spit, soldiers parade, and the excitement causes people to share space and breath more than they would on the street. Games draw thousands into concentrated proximity. A single infected individual can see dozens, if not hundreds of cases in a few hours. Evening. You return home clutching a small purchase from a vendor. Bread still warm, aromatic with oil. Your household shares a single oven. Meals are communal. Children dip spoons into common bowls. A neighbor brings news that someone down the block is ill. Someone suggests calling a physician. Someone else insists on a ritual to appease the gods. A priest arrives and performs a rite that draws neighbors into a confined courtyard. The social instinct to cluster in the face of fear becomes cruelly an accelerant. By the time the sun tips toward the western horizon, you feel a dull ache. Perhaps it's fatigue. Perhaps too much sun. You drink watered wine, taking comfort in the bitter, trusting in a communal habit repeated for generations. Night falls. You cough once. You think little of it. In the morning, or sooner, a fever may take hold. At each junction of this day, the same structural features of Roman urban life turn routine interactions into epidemic opportunities. Shared water, communal latrines, open markets, dense housing, and the constant inflow of goods and people by sea and road. Any one of these things alone is manageable. Together, they form a web that traps the unwary. What happens when the pattern repeats 1,000 times a day across hundreds of neighborhoods? The city begins to change in visible ways. Families abandon houses when death visits them. Corpses pile faster than the municipal services can carry them. Bans on public assembly arrive late or not at all. In antiquity, when burials slowed or burial grounds filled, people often moved the dead to hastily dug pits outside the city. Mass graves that are as much a social emergency as an archaeological testament. The infirm are visited by priests and physicians whose tools are limited. Blood is taken to rebalance humors, herbs are applied, prayers are offered. Without isolation, the sick remain in the same household that must care for them, and the same caregivers become vectors by necessity. Officials, the aediles and other municipal magistrates, can attempt measures. They might try to stop ships from unloading if they suspect cargo is contaminated, or they may order buildings fumigated and bedding burned. But such edicts are blunt instruments applied to a city that depends on the very things you must restrict. Grain must arrive to prevent famine. Baths and markets must function for daily life. Labor can't simply pause. Enforcement is uneven across a vast population and across political priorities. Some attempts at control are sensible, others are superstitious, and some are politically muted because economic survival trumps public health. Religion plays an enormous role in public reaction. Priests and augurs interpret plagues as signs of divine anger. Rituals gather people together at a time when dispersal would be safer. The compulsion to appease gods, to sacrifice or to process in public, paradoxically increases exposure. Simultaneously, fear and grief strain social bonds. Communities sometimes respond with compassion and mutual aid. At other times they fracture. Blame-seeking becomes powerful. Outsiders, minorities, or unpopular groups can be scapegoated. History teaches us to condemn these impulses. Scapegoating neither explains nor resolves the biological problem, and it compounds human suffering. Beyond the immediate horror, a severe epidemic reshapes the economy and society. Widespread mortality leads to labor shortages. Work that once required crowds, construction, shipping, urban services, becomes harder to sustain. Prices for labor can rise. Grain supplies thin. A city built on cheap human wealth must adapt. Political consequences follow. Shortages can feed unrest. Taxes that were taken for granted become unbearable when incomes fall. In the long term, violent shocks to population can change social structures. Household sizes alter, migration patterns shift, and the distribution of wealth and land can be reconfigured. These are not speculative side effects. They are patterns we observe across different periods, including Rome, where documented plagues, like the Antonine outbreak, had deep demographic and political effects. That Antonine example is instructive, but not definitive for every generation of Rome. What matters for our question, why you wouldn't survive a single day, is that the anatomy of Roman urban life makes fast, invisible spread likely. Ships, grain stores, rodents, crowded housing, communal facilities, and shared rituals converge on a person who believes they're merely exploring. Modern immunity, modern sanitation, and modern medical understanding are what tip the scales in our favor today. Strip those away, and the probability that an ordinary day turns lethal rises dramatically. Consider the tiny events you would never notice but which seal your fate. A mouse chews through a grain sack at dawn, a flea migrates to a sailor's cloak, that cloak is lent to a friar. The friar sits down beside you at the baths and coughs. Or a coin, exchanged dozens of times, carries particles from an infected hand to the bread you bite. Each tiny transmission is neutral on its own. Together they construct an invisible siege. Life in the city is not just confronting a crisis of meat and marble, but navigating a lattice of micro-decisions that cumulatively invite disaster. The human cost in such episodes is both immediate and intimate. Houses darken with absence. The living housewife washes sheets by hand until her arms ache. She sets them to dry in the sun while worry gnaws at her. Neighbors who once shared cups now avoid each other like river rats avoid the net. Fear warps rituals. Funerals are hurried. Prayers become frantic. Trust frays. Those called the common people, laborers, women, children, slaves, are usually those who pay the highest price because their lives are most tangled with the functions of the city. Empathy here is not optional. To imagine the past coldly is to forget that every statistic is a person who laughed, loved, and worried. There are cruel ironies too. Some public practices meant to clean or cure can compound danger. A healer might recommend overheating a sick room, crowding it with burning herbs. The smoke drives people out into the street, where they carry the disease further. A municipal order to remove the dead from a neighborhood intended to contain contagion can itself scatter family members, spreading infection to other quarters. Ritual gatherings intended to appease the gods can congregate the healthy and the sick together, accelerating the very calamity they hope to avert. Human action is not always rational in the face of catastrophe. Sometimes it's panic, sometimes it's devotion, and both have consequences. What about the role of animals and goods in seeding a citywide calamity? Freight and livestock bring more than trade. Animals can incubate zoonotic diseases. Grain can harbor spores or attract vermin. The closeness of humans and animals in portside operations, in urban stables, and even in household courtyards makes cross-species transmission feasible. You could be scratched by a domesticated animal whose skin carried pathogens, or you might handle a crate of produce whose interior sheltered vermin. In the congestion of docks and markets, these contacts are ordinary. You might imagine heroic interventions that save you. A physician who recognizes a contagion and seals the house, magistrates who close the port, neighbors who enforce a quarantine. Those things happen sometimes, but the likelihood of those exact measures aligning precisely when and where you need them, in a city that cannot sustain protracted closures without risking famine and unrest, is low. Rome's strength was its circulation of goods and people. Those channels are also the city's Achilles heel when an invisible enemy exploits them. This is not doom for the sake of drama. It's a sober account of structural fragility. We see the same logic in many eras. Dense urban life, global trade, and shared infrastructure are miraculous in what they allow and perilous in what they expose. The lesson is a caution more than a condemnation. Systems that amplify prosperity can also amplify risk. Understanding the past gives us humility about how fragile our present arrangements can be. Imagine finally, together with your household, sitting by an oil lamp as the night closes and realizing the person you walked past this morning is dead. Neighbors speak in hushed tones. Merchants lower their awnings. The city that felt invincible at dawn is rearranged by absence. A voice from the street calls out names of the departed. A bell tolls for the dead. The image is tender and terrible. It compresses the scales. What was ordinary is now signal, and the ordinary life of your day is the very chain that led to catastrophe. Why wouldn't you survive a single day in ancient Rome? Because the structures that made Rome great, dense habitation, integrated trade, shared amenities, and cultural practices of proximity, are the same structures that make rapid, invisible contagion effective. Because you carry no immunity to pathogens moving through that system, and because the medical and civic tools available then are blunt compared to what we have now. Because ordinary acts of living, buying bread, taking a bath, using a latrine, attending a game, bring you into contact with the vectors and networks that transmit disease. Because social reactions can both heal and harm, and because economic dependencies limit the most effective responses. This is not merely historical curiosity, it's a reminder for our time. Modern cities are different in technology, but similar in principle. We remain deeply connected, dependent on supply chains, and vulnerable when invisible agents exploit those connections. Respect for systemic fragility is not fear. It is prudence. It means investing in public health, in surveillance, in fair systems that don't force the poorest to shoulder the greatest risk. It means recognizing that our everyday routines can become conduits, for better and for worse. So when you watch reconstructions of Rome, the gleaming forums, the arches streaked with history, the idea of order and power, remember the shadow that rests beneath the marble. The city's beauty sits atop a lattice that, in the absence of modern medicine and sanitation, makes ordinary life perilous. That is why a modern stranger, unprepared and unprotected, would very likely not survive a single day. If you want to see how a different era handled catastrophe, watch our video on another epoch's response to mass disease and disaster.